Welcome to One Wild World, where today we're venturing into the treetops of Australia with someone who knows the ins and outs of one of the most iconic creatures down under, a zoologist at Flinders University and the author of Koala, A Natural History and an Uncertain Future. Dr. Danielle Clode takes us on a journey into the world of koalas. This is an exploration into the life of a creature that's as enigmatic as it is cuddly, armed with unique adaptations like a stomach made for eucalyptus and a grip that could make any climber envious. We're diving into everything from the koala's fossil record to the modern-day challenges these marsupials face, threading the needle between their ancient past and their increasingly uncertain future. Dr. Clode brings us face to face with the realities of conservation, the fascinating biology of koalas, and why these creatures continue to capture our hearts and minds. It's a story of resilience, evolution, and the complex relationships between species and their environment. So pull up a branch and settle in. We're about to unravel the story of the koala. Danielle, I'm hoping, can you expand a little bit more on the work that you do?
Well, primarily I'm a nature writer and a science writer. So I did train as a zoologist and a conservation biologist, but most of the time I've been writing books about Australian nature. So that's given me a really broad overview in Australia's fossil history, some of the history of science, so all sorts of different topics. But koalas is definitely pretty close to my heart and close to my original training.
Now, I'm curious where that passion first started for you working with animals.
I actually started my studies, I was doing psychology, and I very quickly decided that I wasn't all that interested in working with people. I thought that animals were much more interesting. I had one subject that was animal behaviour, so I specialised in that and did my first honours research project at the Adelaide Zoo. So that really kick-started my interest in studying animals, and then when I did my PhD in the UK, I became a zoologist by default. So that was also where I really had my first close encounters with koalas as well, was in the Adelaide Zoo, looking after them.
I think zoos can be such an amazing place when they're done right. They can spark this passion and curiosity for lots of different people because you get such a plethora of animals to look at. Today, we're going to be talking a lot about koalas because of your book, but I'm curious if there's something that really sparked you more about koalas than any other mammal.
Koalas are an interesting one for Australians in particular. They're an animal everybody knows, everybody thinks they know a lot about, but probably doesn't. And you kind of take them for granted, I think, even though Australians have never seen one in the wild. So along the east coast of Australia, they're really quite uncommon to see in the wild. Where I live in Adelaide, they're actually quite common. So we see them quite a bit, but that's really unusual. So most people don't see them in the wild. So I guess that's the curious thing is when you actually start to look into koalas and find out a little bit about them, you realise, well, I certainly realised just how much I didn't know about them and how much more there was to know. So, yeah, I think we just tend to think of them as a cute face on a postcard or a book cover. But there's a lot more to them than that.
Yeah, I think that's a trend that goes for all animals. The more you look into them and the more you research, the more you learn and discover than you had previously thought was going on with that animal. And so I know reading your book, I kept learning new things along the way. And I was like, oh, cool. Like, I thought I knew a lot about koalas coming into this, but it was really exciting. One thing that I took away from the book, especially, was so much about the fossil record. I hadn't expected that to be part of this book. And so it was really amazing to go through that section. Did you know a lot about the fossil record before starting this book?
Not about koalas. I've previously written books on Australia's fossil records. I work quite closely with the paleontology lab at Flinders University, and I'm really lucky to have one of the best paleontology labs right there. So I knew where to go to ask the questions. And fortunately, I had several paleontologists across the country helping me a lot with that. And I think the thing, having had that experience with paleontologists, I guess I've learnt that you can really get a different perspective on the animals that are alive today by looking at where they've come from and what their evolutionary history is in the distant past. So that was an important place for me to start.
So I know that 2/3 of Australia's native mammals are marsupials, and that koalas are obviously one of those. But can you explain what makes a marsupial so unique amongst mammals?
So marsupials are a group of mammals that split off fairly early from the eutherian or placental mammals that most Northern Hemisphere people are more familiar with. So, your typical cats and dogs and humans and bears and all of those things. So that the characteristic feature of the marsupial is, of course, their pouch. So they have very different reproductive system to other mammals, and they give birth to tiny little jelly bean-sized babies, pink little hairless things that crawl up through the mother's fur into her pouch, and they attach themselves onto the nipple, and they really continue the rest of their early development in the pouch. So it's almost like marsupials have an external pregnancy. So the first phase is inside, and then they put the baby in the pouch and keep it there, which personally I think is an exceptionally sensible reproductive strategy, and I really think we missed out. Because even once the joeys emerge from the pouch, which is like a second birth, they start to come out of the pouch and explore. They keep going back into the pouch, as most famously with kangaroos carrying their young for quite a long time. So, it's really handy for the mothers, for sure.
I do think that kangaroos definitely got the most popular and widespread knowledge of animals that have pouches. And I don't think that many people even know that koalas have pouches as well.
The pouches vary quite a lot in marsupials. So you get a really big, full developed pouch with the kangaroos where they carry their young because they stand upright. It's like a really good pocket. Whereas other ones just have a skin flap or a fold. And that's a more common system with the opossums of South America, which are also marsupials. So the pouch does vary and is almost absent in some marsupials.
One thing that I love that you did in your book was you said the scientific name of the koala, but then you also broke that apart into what it means. And I'm hoping you could do that again for us now.
Oh, yeah. The Phascolarctos, so the arctos component is to do with the bear. So it's a pouched ash bear. Refers to the Phascolarctos cinereus. The second part is to do with the ashy colour of their coat, the grey-brown, and the other bit is to do with them being a pouched bear.
When I was studying mammals in college, that term cinereus pops up a lot in scientific names, and I never really knew what that part meant. I knew a lot of the other components of Latin words. And so as I was reading this book and you described the koala's scientific name and that it means an ashy colored pouched bear, I looked at that word and started to think through all of these mammals I've studied and I just love that science can do that. They're not just jargon words that are thrown together, that there's a lot of meaning behind those word parts.
That's right. You'd be interested then in the name of the group that koalas belong to is the diprotodons. And that's one I always really like talking about in schools because a lot of the diprotodons have a great big pair of front teeth that come out of their bottom jaw and they actually stick straight out forwards, which looks really strange when you see them in a fossil. But the name diprotodon means di for two, proto for first or front, and don for teeth. So their name is two front teeth.
All I Want for Christmas is Diprotodons, the lesser-known name for that song. Well, you read my mind. Another question that I had was, could you break apart Diprotodon, which is the group that koalas are a part of within marsupials? And there's other members that we know of current day that are part of that family, correct?
Yeah, so that's quite a big family. But the interesting thing about koalas is that they're part of a smaller group within that, which only has one other sort of close relative, which is the wombats. There are 3 species of wombats, but it's wombats and koalas that are the only ones left. But there used to be a lot more in that group. There's a species called a diprotodon, which was the largest of that group, and they were megafauna. So Australia didn't have the same megafauna as the Northern Hemisphere. We didn't have woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. We had giant marsupials, and the diprotodon was like a very, very large bear, but it was a marsupial. It had a pouch and it carried its young in its pouch. But yeah, that was the biggest one. It weighed about 2 or 3 tons and was sort of the size of a small 4-wheel drive car, which is much more bear-like than a koala.
One thing, again, that I really took away from this book was an appreciation for the fossil record and that whole section of your book where you explore the fossil record. For me, it was really surprising to know that sometimes all you can find is a single tooth, but that can still tell you so much about that ancestor to the koala. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the teeth are the most common thing to find in the fossil record because teeth are harder than bone. So they're the thing that survives. And very often, teeth are so hard that you'll actually get a bit of jawbone surviving because it's attached to some teeth. So typically it's teeth and a bit of jawbone that's the things that are left. Australia has quite a poor fossil record because of the age and the wear on the rocks that we have. So it's quite an eroded landscape. We don't have a massively good preservation record, so we tend to just have a lot of fragments, and that's particularly true for this period and through koalas' prehistory. So fortunately, teeth are a highly evolved part of an animal because what kind of teeth you have determines how well you can eat and survive. That's really crucial for your survival. So teeth evolve quite rapidly and change quite rapidly depending upon what you're eating for many species. And koalas, that's certainly true. So koalas have highly specialised teeth to cut through the type of leaves that they eat, and that changes presumably depending on what type of leaf they eat. So if they're eating softer leaves, they'll have much less serrated teeth. And if they're eating things like eucalypt leaves, which are incredibly tough, that's presumably why modern koalas have really sharp cusped teeth with lots of serrations on them. They're a little bit like pinking scissors that make the zigzag cuts for cutting fabric. That's the pattern they tend to make with the leaves when they cut. So that's the sort of teeth they've got.
That's a wonderful little bit of education there. And yeah, I know exactly the type of scissors you're talking about. With the topic of eucalyptus trees, I know that those leaves aren't for every animal because in some capacity they're toxic. What kind of adaptations beyond just teeth do koalas have to help them process those leaves?
Massive adaptations. I think this is really the secret of the koala's success. The eucalyptus leaves are highly fibrous, and that's not unusual for a herbivore's diet. Grass is really fibrous and it's full of silicates, and it's definitely trying to stop things from eating it. So the herbivores who eat grass have to have very complex stomachs in order to break down the fibres, and they also have to have special microbes in their stomachs to help them break down the fibres, because generally mammals can't break down cellulose and lignin themselves. They have to have microbes to do that. So koalas are in the same boat. They have to have those as well because eucalyptus leaves have got a lot of lignin and cellulose in them. So they have a special gut bacteria to help them break it down, and they have to have a special gut to hold that bacteria. And they do it in a part of the digestive system that in us is called the appendix. And it's a tiny little bit of the digestive system about the size of your thumb. But in a koala, it's almost 2 meters long. So it's a huge, long balloon type structure that's full of this sort of liquid microbial soup. They chew up the leaves, wash all the nutrients out of the leaves in their stomach, and then that all washes into the cecum and it gets digested by the microbes. Eucalypts have another problem, and that's that they contain a lot of toxins. So they contain a lot of oils that make mammals especially, feel sick. They feel nauseous if they eat too many of them. So koalas have dealt with this by having a supercharged liver. And they have a large, complex liver that seems to have extra genetic coding for dealing with toxins. They're so effective at dealing with toxins that it's actually quite hard to treat koalas for diseases because they treat medicines as toxins as well. So, for example, a dose of chlamydia treatment in humans would only take 3 days' worth of medicine. But the same medication in a koala, because koalas also suffer from chlamydia, takes 30 days of treatment. So they're really hard to treat.
Wow. I've heard that koalas do have a big problem with chlamydia, but that's really fascinating to learn just how well their body is adapted to process all of that eucalyptus and the toxins within it, especially that their appendix or the same type of organ is so much longer than it is in humans. That's amazing.
So we call it the appendix because it's the appendage of the cecum. It's the bit left over.
I'm hoping you can kind of expand on what we were just talking about with how koalas eat eucalyptus and how they can kind of be picky with it. And I know people have also made what I think is a misconception about koalas just hanging out in trees all the times because of this toxin making them either drunk or high. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, no. That's the short answer. Yeah, look, people have gotten very confused over koalas eating eucalyptus leaves because koalas do sleep a lot. So people have argued that, well, they have to sleep a lot because they don't get much energy from their food. Therefore, they have a low metabolism and they're not very smart because they can't support a big brain. So it leads into a lot of misconceptions. It doesn't really make sense to say that if you've got a low energy diet, you have to eat less, you have to sleep more. You'd actually have to eat more if you've got a low energy diet. So it's not a logical sequence, that particular argument. Koalas eat much the same amount of vegetative material as a goat or a herbivore of the same size does. The thing that they're doing when they're resting in the trees is that they sleep a lot. I actually think is simply because they don't have to move anywhere. Most herbivores, grazing herbivores that we're familiar with and see, are always on the alert because they're worried about predators catching them unawares or chasing them. So they're always awake. They sleep very little because of that. But if you have an animal that doesn't need to be alert for predators, say like your cat or your dog, they tend to spend a lot of time sleeping. And the koala is doing the same thing because it lives in a tree, and its best strategy against predators is to keep still and hope nobody notices it. And so that's what they may as well do when they're asleep. So they actually simply have a very chill, relaxed lifestyle. And if you've ever seen pictures of koalas sleeping in trees, you know they do indeed look extremely relaxed. But if you go and poke a koala when it's asleep in a tree, you'll soon find out it's not stoned and it's not very relaxed about being poked. It'll react quite strongly to that.
All right, don't go around poking koalas. Noted. You made this comparison in your book that it's kind of like a cat or a dog you might have at your house where they have everything they need. They have food and water taken care of, they have shelter, so there's not really much else that they need. So they can kind of just relax and take it easy. Are there any other misconceptions with koalas that you learned throughout writing this book that you want to break down now?
Yeah, I mean, the brain issue is a pervasive one. There's a tendency, I think, for most colonial societies in particular, to assume that the animals of the new country are less well adapted or primitive versions of the ones you get in Europe, for example. And America suffered from that. You know, early European scientists thought that American animals were degenerate and there was something wrong with them just because they're different. Marsupials suffer from the same thing, and only with the added problem that they're all in the southern hemisphere, so they're not commonly seen by northern hemisphere people. That makes them even more strange. And there's an idea that marsupials are somehow a bit dumb. You know, marsupials vary in their cognitive capacities, and koalas in particular, because they sleep a lot and are slow and not seen doing very much, people think that they have small brains. And some early studies suggested that their brain only took up 60% of the brain cavity, which is a really weird thing. Brain cavities are usually the same size as the brain that they encase. They don't usually have big gaps in them around the brain itself. But I think that was just due to looking at pickled brains that had been kept in preservative and shrunk. So now when we look at modern autopsy results or even MRI scans, we see that the koala brain is, when it's alive, perfectly normal size for its skull. And indeed, it is a perfectly average-sized brain for a mammal of that size. So if we compare it with the other mammals, it's perfectly normal and average. The ones that are weird and off the scale are actually primates. So primates have really weirdly big brains. So they're the ones that are a bit off the scale.
Yeah, and in that section, when you're talking about the brains and how they align with other mammals on the size comparison to body size, there were some outliers within marsupials, but it was the American opossum that didn't really have the same brain size to body mass. Is that correct?
Yeah. So all of the species, you know, some of them sit a little bit below the line, some of them sit a little bit above the line. They're all sort of in a rough line together. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, it's the Virginia opossum is a little bit on the downside, which is unfortunate because that's the one everybody's most familiar with in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, I feel like, especially in the US, we see a lot of that. I know on social media, there's a lot of content that features opossums, and maybe that's just my social media, but I feel like people don't necessarily often see the best sides of opossums. And then they expand that to think, well, all marsupials must be that kind of way. So I feel like it paints a bad picture for them all.
Yeah, it does. And you're not always so keen on the animals that rummage around in your rubbish bins or make weird noises in your garden.
To keep going with koala adaptations and what makes them unique, koalas have two fingers or thumbs on one side of their hands. And I've always gotten confused if that is what is referred to as syndactylus or if that is a different word. But can you explain what that word syndactylus means a bit more for our listeners?
Well, syndactyly actually refers to the two fingers that are joined together on their foot, which is actually a surprisingly common feature of quite a few marsupials. Kangaroos' feet, for example, have taken that to a great extreme with just having the one great big toe and the two side ones. I think there's two. But a lot of Australian marsupials have these two fingers that are joined together, and they use that one for grooming. That's called syndactyly. And I think humans sometimes suffer from a condition called syndactyly where the two fingers are joined together, which is where most people would be more familiar with it. But it's a natural feature, and the two claws are then used like a comb for grooming. But they also have these thumbs as well. So on their hand, they sort of split. So two are thumbs and then three are fingers. And on the feet, they have one big thumb with no claw, the two joined together, and then the other two are separate. So they're quite strange looking hands because they do look a little bit human, but they don't because of this strange configuration. But they're quite long fingered. And of course, they've got these great big claws off the end, which are also quite strange. But the most remarkable thing about that is also that, of course, they've got fingerprints on those hands, and they're one of the few animals outside the primates to have fingerprints. So that's a really strange feature.
There's a picture on the internet that shows just how close, in fact, fingerprints of koalas are to humans, and that if for whatever reason a koala found itself at the scene of a crime, that it would really throw off the investigation because of just how human-like these fingerprints look.
They'd never identify that one.
Yeah, it's the perfect alibi for koalas looking to do crimes there. So in 2019 and into the early parts of 2020, the fire season in Australia took over 60,000 lives of koalas. And then in 2022, the Australian government declared koalas as endangered in New South Wales and Queensland. But I'm curious, from your perspective, looking into the future, what do you think the biggest threats to koalas are?
It's one of the great mysteries of koala biology that we have a rapidly declining population on the east coast of Queensland and New South Wales, and yet on the south coast of Victoria and South Australia, we have booming koala populations, so they're quite abundant here. You know, it's quite a mystery. Both of those areas suffer from bushfires. Both of them suffer from fragmented forest habitat. They have the same development pressures. One distinct difference is that disease plays a bigger role in the East Coast populations, but those diseases have always been in koala populations. So it's almost as if there's something going on in the East Coast that's causing the diseases to have a worse impact rather than the diseases being the source of the problem. There's certainly a big problem for them, particularly chlamydia, and also a koala retrovirus is having a really big impact on the population, which creates an AIDS-like disease, which of course makes chlamydia worse. So those combined factors are a problem. I think probably the biggest difference between the two populations, aside from the disease, is that there's still native forest logging going on in the East Coast states. So they're still logging the native forests, which doesn't mean that they clear them, but it radically changes the nature of the forest, and it has a particularly bad effect on the distribution of koala feed trees. So koalas are very, very specific about what feed trees they need. They can't eat all eucalypts. There's up to 900 species of eucalypts in Australia. Koalas only eat 70, and any one koala will only eat between 3 and 10 species. So they're very specific. They need a really big forest to support one koala. So you need a forest the size of an average sports field to support a single koala. So each koala needs a really big area of forest. any impact on those forests is going to have a big impact on the survival of koalas. So then you add bushfires on top of that, which of course are increasing because of climate change. They're increasing in frequency and severity in Australia. Australia's always had a history of bushfires, and our ecology is adapted to that. But these are happening much faster, and they're burning areas that have never burnt before ever. That's having a big impact as well. So there's a whole combination of factors that are impacting on those koala populations, as well as human development. That's the other big one. So our cities are growing, and they're growing into koala habitat. So we really need to look at ways of ensuring that where we live as humans, we still retain enough habitat for other species as well.
Yeah, definitely. And looking at those human-wildlife interactions is so important, and finding ways in your daily life to make small changes, whether that's turning lights off towards the end of the night to decrease on light pollution, or learning how to recycle more or compost. Are there any tips that you can give for people that live in Australia as changes they can make that might benefit koalas?
One of the biggest things is just the importance of protecting trees, and especially protecting the old gum trees. A lot of cities have old remnant forest trees that have survived. So, they can be over 200 years old, but, they're there from the original forest that was there. And those really, really need to be protected. The problem is, as they age, they do drop branches on people and cars and houses. So that is a problem. But nonetheless, they are so important for biodiversity. They're like the nurseries of biodiversity on land, and especially the trees along the river systems, which are more productive. That's where all the animals need to breed, the birds, the koalas. Lots of things live in those trees, and all the invertebrates. So we're losing trees in our city, even in Adelaide, where we actually have, I think it's the only population of koalas that lives in the city. So they're actually moving down from the forested hills into the city parks, which is amazing. But we're still cutting down trees. We're still losing tree cover through our city as people build more intense developments. And we really need to learn that trees cannot be removed. They have to be protected.
Protecting the space that's there, especially as humans cut off those ways for animals to get from one area to another, whether that's green belts or historic migration routes, are so important to make sure that there are still ways for animals to travel and thrive. Again, I think your book, Koala, A Natural History and an Uncertain Future, does a really good job of being this journey where you yourself are learning and discovering so much about the world of koalas. I'm curious if you have any advice that you'd give to people who are curious about wildlife.
That's one of the interesting things, is you don't have to go out into the wild to learn about wildlife. I've written previous books actually about a Australian naturalist, Edith Coleman, who used to do a lot of her research in her backyard, and she solved some of the great mysteries of orchid pollination that had puzzled Darwin by doing work in her garden and kitchen sink. So you can learn about wildlife wherever you are. She used to say all you need is a windowsill, a bit of patience, and a willingness to watch what's going on. So I think just having that close attention, spending time outside with nature and providing a little bit of habitat, and you'll be amazed at what comes to you.
That is one of my favorite things that I try to pass on to people, is that whether it's a national park that is nearby or maybe it's a state park, but it can even be a neighborhood park and even just your backyard. There's animals that are all around, and if you just sit and watch, you'll see some behavior or you'll learn something that an animal will do, and it will lead you down this rabbit hole of, I wonder why this squirrel or this rabbit was doing this. And let me do a quick Google, and now there you go. Now you have this whole lifelong journey ahead of you.
I think that change of perspective too, of thinking, what's the animal doing? Why is it doing this? What does it need? Rather than thinking about ourselves all the time, is the thing that really changes things. And I got a lot from just that mental exercise with koalas, was just trying to put myself into the place of the koala and think about what its perceptions and needs were.
Yeah, I'm curious now that you've written this book about koalas, if there's another animal in Australia that you're going to focus on next.
There are so many interesting animals that you could work on in Australia. It's funny, koalas are the best studied of all the Australian animals. There's a whole heap of other amazing ones that have had almost nothing done on them. So it would be great to work on one of those. But I don't have any set plans. I'm just seeing how things pan out for the moment.
Absolutely. Well, for our listeners, is there a best way to support you as an author or just the work that you do in general?
Wow, that's a really good. Obviously, buy books. Buying books is the best way to support authors. I guess, I've written quite a lot of books and a lot of stuff about bushfires and lots of other Australian animals, the fossils and things for kids. So, yeah, visit my website and follow my social media. I'd love to hear from people and hear their thoughts on what they think about the book and how they've reacted to it.
Well, thank you for being on the show today. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I know that our listeners will too. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe. And to find out more about the work we do to support animals, visit our website at theechofilm.com. Follow us on Instagram at theechoanimals, and follow our TikTok at creature.feature. On behalf of all creatures, big and small, thank you for listening.